Hello everyone, it is Created by Lottie here, but just before we do dive straight into it, I want to apologise for the camera cropping quality going on at the start of this video. I promise it's only at the start, it does get better once I've finished cutting the glass. I have since bought an external monitor for my camera because I had it on the wrong setting, so hopefully that will never happen again going forward. And if you would also like to join me in making your own Bulbasaur, you can follow the link in the description to my Patreon where he and many other templates are available to download. Okay, so let's talk Bulbasaur. Prior to me actually starting to cut the glass, you'll see I've already stuck my template down to the sheets of glass that I want to use. I have a separate video that goes into way more depth on this and I'll attach a little link to it here. So I cut my template out using a Cricut. I have the Maker 3 I think, and essentially it's just a fancy cutting machine. Scissors do the same thing, it just saves time. I have slightly changed my method that I mentioned in that last video, so now I actually use card instead of paper. I find it just is a little bit more durable and it holds shape of some of the thinner pieces a little bit better. And I also use Pritt Stick because it is cheaper and it's quicker to stick the templates down with. On some of the templates you'll notice that I scribble a letter down or an arrow, and basically I'm telling myself the colour that this particular piece needs to be. And also if it's streaky glass that I'm using, I like to remind myself the direction that I want the streaks to go so that they best complement the template. When I'm working with a glass that's just like this one, a flat colour, and I don't have to worry about the direction of streaks, I try to stick my template pieces down as close as possible without getting too frustrated at how difficult I've made some of the cuts, because there is a fine line on being conservative and saving glass and making a project 10 times harder than it really needs to be. So when I finally get to cutting the glass, you'll notice that I tend to jump between 3 pairs of main pliers, and they're the silver schnitz, which are the ones I just had. These pliers, which are actually new for me, and they are narrow tip grazing pliers, I believe, and my large running pliers that I only really use if I'm breaking off large sections of glass. When I'm cutting my glass, I try to start with the hardest angle first, so that means any curve that goes inwards towards the template. It just means you've got more glass supporting what you're trying to cut out, so you're less likely to get a horrible crack during the process. And then once all the hard cuts are done, I'll go ahead and do the easier ones. I really like this Bulbasaur template, and I think it's just the simplicity and the symmetry that goes along with it. So I will let you enjoy the rest of this music while I finish off the last few pieces of Bulbasaur and we can move on to the grinding stage. So when I first started making stained glass, I think I actually really enjoyed grinding, but it didn't take long for the novelty to wear off. And it's really not my favorite. It's also not very exciting to watch, so I'll quickly run through my setup. And I have a Technoglass, the grinder 2. I like to use a 1-inch grinding bit, and then the little one that I stack on top is a 3/4 inch grinding bit. The little turquoise thing I'm holding is called a grinder cookie, and it just helps protect my fingers when I push the glass forward. And I've also got silicone finger protectors on too. On the templates I make, I allow for about a 1mm gap in between each piece of glass, and this is to give way for the copper foil when I add it, so I'm looking for that same gap between the pieces of glass when I've ground them down as well. So once I've ground all the glass down and cleaned off all of the glass dust residue, it's finally time to paint. and I use Pebiovica 360 glass paint. And for Bulbasaur, I only use 3 colours, and that is their ink black, turquoise and red. I'm using a light box here, and that helps me see where I need to draw the paint onto the glass. As you can see, it's not the easiest to see, so I do often make a few mistakes, but that's okay. This glass is super easy to wipe off and redo. When I'm happy with the outline, I also like to hold the glass just onto the light box so I can see that I've got a really nice smooth finish, because you have to remember this is going to be held up to the sun and some light will still pass through the opaque glass, so I want to make sure I've got a really nice thick covering. So I have tried a variety of different types of paintbrushes, but I found these are my favorite. I do have them on my Amazon storefront, so you can buy them if you want to try the same ones as me. They are modeling brushes, and I think that's why they work so well, because they're used to making really tiny, minute details. This is a painting technique I like to do when the glass is a little bit too opaque for me to see. And as you can see, I can kind of see where his smiley face is, but it's difficult. So I'll put little dots down to mark the main corners and angles. So when I just need to draw the straight line across, I can join them all together a little bit like a dot to dot. If you've seen my other painting video, which I will link here, you'll know that I have a projector for when the glass is too opaque, but I'm not about to whip it out just to do a smiley face. This method works perfectly fine. Then once he is all painted, I'll leave him to dry for about 24 hours before popping him in the oven. I set it to 160 degrees centigrade and I cook him for 35 minutes. Time to copper foil, or as it is also known in my house, time to catch up on my Netflix, because it's a pretty easy task to do. So especially when you've got a big piece to work on, it's nice to have some noise in the background. I'm using 3/16 black backed copper foil. This is my favorite type. The brand I use, I will just link it here. It's my favorite brand. I've never variated from any other brands. I've heard some people have issues with lifting and the glue seeping out, and I've never had it with this brand, so I'll continue to use it. My method is pretty straightforward. Firstly, I like to line up the piece on my glass. I try and make sure it's as symmetrical as possible, but you know, this is handmade, so it's never going to be perfect. You don't need to beat yourself up about it, as long as you've got a nice covering on both sides. Then I gently flatten down the foil on the face sides with my burnishing tool. I'll come back to that later, but the next step is to just really flatten down the edges to make sure that there's not too much poking in the way, so the template sits together nicely. And then I lie my piece of glass flat on a surface, and that's when I really make sure those edges are nicely stuck down, and that's it. So we're on to the final stage, and Bulbasaur is looking fabulous already. I have to again apologise for my camera in this, it was playing it, but that shouldn't happen again. Why is technology so difficult? Anyway, I'm using here a liquid flux. I like a liquid flux. I find it easy to work with, and it's the Novacan brand. And the first thing I do, because I haven't pinned him together, which I usually do, but he's a small, simple template, I just dot blobs of solder in his joints to hold him together before I go in and apply the solder across the seams. So over the years, I have changed my soldering method again, and before I would do like a first pass, a second pass, and then probably a third pass, making sure I was happy with the solder. And I think that was because I didn't want to spend too long in a certain area with heat cracks, but I have since turned my soldering iron down. I use a temperature mainly on 360 all the time now, and touch wood, I hope I haven't jinxed it now. I haven't had any heat cracks recently. So my current method is to pretty much try and get it right on the first pass, we'll say. I actually find the solder when it's still hot, it's still a little bit warm when I've only recently done a section, it's easier to fix. If there's a problem, I don't have to heat the solder up again and then fix it. Doing a solid line of solder, I like to drag the end across the joint slightly, that you can see right here. And that is because I notice when I lift my soldering iron up, it gets like a ricochet of the melted metal. I don't know if that's the right word, but I think you know what I mean. And I don't like that it leaves an indent into the smooth line I've just done. So I drag it across to the next line, and then I can fix that next line and do the same thing by dragging the end of that across to the other line. I hope that makes sense. You can sort of see here where I'm neatening up the last ricochet, we'll call it, and then I'll drag the end of this piece onto the adjoining line and then let that ricochet again. I think that should be an official soldering term, the ricochet at the end. It probably already has a term, I just don't know what it is. Because I think it's virtually impossible to get a completely smooth line of solder the whole way through, I like to imagine my pieces as having a background and a foreground. So for example, on Bulbasaur, the background would be his bulb, and the foreground in this piece would be his face. And I like to make the solder joins of the foreground the last thing I do, so it's almost like the joins sit on top of the ones in the background. It's pretty much completely irrelevant, and I don't think anyone will ever notice it, but it just helps me visualize how I want a piece to look and the neatest sections of solder where I want them to be. And because I make so many character stained glass pieces, that's usually in the face. And once the main body of the soldering's doing, it's time to attach the jump rings. So I always like to design the template with the jump rings in mind and where I'm going to place them. And I like them to be on a join because they just have that extra strength of the added solder there, so it's not just attached to a tinned section of copper foil. And I also want the piece to hang nicely. I have done it before where I made a Diglett and the weight was off, so where I put the jump rings, he hung and he flipped upside down, but I did fix it. It was okay in the end. I got this pack of jump rings off Amazon. At first I was worried they had to be a certain metal, but that never seems to have been an issue. I like that it has loads of different sizes, so they fit pretty much any project I'm working on. And I just put a dot of flux on either side of the joint and on the jump rings. I use a 2mm piece of float glass just to hold the jump ring in place, so it's sort of in the middle of the piece of glass, and then put a blob of foil on, a blob of solder on, and then I flip over Bulbasaur and I do the same to the other side just to hold it in place. I will secure them on more once I've finished the cane on the outside of the piece, but for now I just need to hold them in place. Okay, the cane. I know cane scares a lot of people, and I love it. I'm hoping to maybe dispel some of your fears in this video, but we'll see how we go. The reason my cane looks so straight is because I've pre-stretched it, and that is exactly how it sounds. I've literally stretched the cane. So I have a little vise that I put one end in, and then on the other end I attach some pliers, and I just pull it as straight as I possibly can. I've seen some people on the internet saying that their cane can grow an inch longer when they stretch it. When you're working with hobby cane, that's not the case. Essentially, you just want to pull any wrinkles out of it, because I don't think I physically have the strength to make this stretch an inch longer. I got my little stretching vise actually off Amazon, but if you don't have one of those and if you don't want to have to attach it somewhere, you can just hold pliers on either side and just stretch it outwards. So I try where possible to use one continuous piece of cane. So as you can see here, I've curved it from the inside of his little foot along the outside all the way up to where the jump ring is, and that's where I've clipped it off. And because there are a few hinge joints on this Bulbasaur design, the cane does an excellent job of adding additional support. And then I add blobs of solder where the cane meets the joints. I will go back and neaten these up later on. It's pretty much just to hold it in place at this point. Because so far working with stained glass, I mean it's glass that you're working with, everything is being pretty gentle and kind of fragile. I find when you're applying the cane, you actually do have to apply a little bit more force than you expect to, just to really make sure you can get it into those nuts and crannies. But there's sort of like a middle ground where it's enough force to push it into place, but not too much force that you're going to damage the glass. And for these tiny little, I don't know what they're called, tips of his bulb, honestly I couldn't be bothered to cut off tiny pieces of cane to apply there. I thought I'd have a much nicer effect if I just tinned the edges. So I'll tin them first with a really thin coating of solder, and then I'll go on and add a bead of solder just so it has that nice finish to it. Then I just have to pretty much finish off applying the rest of the cane. I like to make sure that at this point that the jump rings are really nicely adhered to not only the solder in the glass but also the lead cane. Then I'll make sure the cane is really nicely adhered to the piece by attaching it to any copper foil that's showing through, and make sure it's attached on all the joins as well. And during this process I just like to neaten up any little unsightly bits that I may have missed out before, but I'm pretty much nearing the end of him now. Once I've actually finished soldering him, I like to go over with a really fine grade wire wool. I go along all the solder lines and also the lead cane as well. Then I'll wash him, and I think I use the UK equivalent to America Has Dawn soap. I use Fairy Liquid, and just give him a scrub with that to remove any residue, mainly from the flux. Then I'll dry him off with just some paper towels and I patina him. I'm going to patina him black. It's my favourite. I think it's perfect for the outline, like pencil lines on cartoon characters, and it also gets super shiny too. Unfortunately, I didn't film my patina method, but I did film my polishing method. So I use a carbonara car wax as my polish, and when I'm applying it, my main goal is just to apply a thin layer over all of the solder and the cane as well, and to sort of polish it while I'm applying it. I leave him overnight and then come back to him, and the polish has sort of made a sheen over his surface. Now, this next stage, you can simply just buff it out with a rag. However, I've started to use a tub of sawdust. This is because I do this so often, it just makes it slightly quicker for me. I'm hesitant that some of my methods may put off anyone that wants to get into the hobby of stained glass, thinking, oh my god, there's so much extra stuff involved. This is completely unnecessary. It's just something I do because I do this, like I said, all the time. Basically, the sawdust sticks to any extra wax, and the nail brush that I'm using as well just helps to buff out the surface. I still buff it with my cloth after, just to give it that extra shine, and finally I go over everything with a cuticle stick just to get any wax or sawdust out of the corners and weird nooks and crannies. And I also use a toothbrush to go along the edges of the lead cane just to make sure there's no wax or sawdust sticking in there too. Okay, so now we're at the very last step, and that is to add a chain. I love jag chains because there's no way of a link in the chain coming loose, because it all uses gravity to attach it to the other chain. If that makes sense, I think it does. Whew, we made it, guys. Thank you so much. Made it all the way to the end of this video. So this is 001 Bulbasaur in my Pokemon series. So I'm not sure how long this series is going to take me to finish, considering I'm probably only going to manage 1 or 2 of these a month, but I'm going to give it my best. So I can't wait to see you next time when we start number 002 Ivysaur.